Well, hello again, everybody, and welcome to the Live Wire on Inside UNC Charlotte. And today we're talking about one of the university's signature annual events that's coming up in just about a month now, the annual Science Festival at UNC Charlotte. And with us today are two of the lead instigators behind this year's event. Jim Hathaway, who by day is the person who handles science research, not just science research, but research communications at UNC Charlotte, and Ian Binns, who is on the faculty as an assistant professor of science education. And both of you are centrally involved in developing this year's Science Festival, which I have a hunch most of the people watching this are somewhat, if not very familiar with it, but we want to talk in depth about what's up for this year's event and some other ideas like why this is important, why this is good for the university, but more importantly, why it's great for the community, and some of the ways that this year's event kind of broadens the offerings to even have more appeal to more people. Some really exciting things in the works. And I will acknowledge at the outset, I did not put on the Dayglow shirt. I did put on the button that says that I'm a proud science geek, and I can tell you that
you're not.
The word science and I usually don't go together.
So proud geek.
I'm proud and I am a geek, so
okay,
I'm a proud geek. But
the real reason is that he didn't think this matched his eyes. So.
There's not enough red in it. But,
yeah, that's right.
But let's get started talking through a little bit about the background of the Science Festival and how it fits in with the broader sense of a statewide focus on science and why we do this in North Carolina. Let's start with you, Jim, and give us the background of what we're talking about.
Well, for 4 years now, working out of the Moorhead Planetarium up at Chapel Hill, there's been this statewide effort to have this statewide science festival. It's called the North Carolina Science Festival. You see the logo. And this is something that they've been reaching out for 4 years to people around the state to get involved, do things that'll interest the public in science and technology. And they approached us 3 years ago, and we got started doing it, and we've been growing every year. We were successful enough last year that people around here said, this is great, we ought to do more of it. So we're doing even more of it this year. And we've gone from having an expo, which is it's a science fair in essence, though it involves faculty showing what they do, involves people who are involved in science education, like Dr. Binns here, teaching people how to teach science, showing how to get kids enthused about it. And the big point of that, really, of the whole thing, is that it really is important to interest kids in science. We don't interest enough of our children in science, and they don't want to continue with it when they go to college, if they go to college. And we have a sense that we can intervene early and get them going. We also have a sense that the public in general doesn't really have any idea often of what kind of wonderful things are going on at their universities around the state, universities and science museums. There's an awful lot of science in North Carolina between the Triangle and us and North Carolina Research Campus. We're one of the most science-intensive states in the country, and people ought to see some of what's going on at it. It's really cool stuff. So this year, we've expanded from doing the expo to doing a big lecture series and then doing a film series.
All right, well, let's talk about some of the details of this year's festival. And Ian, let's start with you and talk a little bit about, as we look at the poster for this year's event, I'm sure most folks would agree when they see this poster that there definitely is a message here for a young audience, that it's for them, but at the same time, some of these lectures and discussions are going to involve some heavy intellectual lifting, but not anything that should be leaving people like me, who are geeky but not necessarily sciencey, feeling left out. In other words, there's a lot of relevant, current, broad appeal content in some of these lectures, would you say?
Yes, and I think the idea with the lecture series was to have people, especially faculty on campus, who are able to actually communicate their work, their research to the lay audience, to the general audience, as a way to get them more engaged. And so that's, you see that I'm doing one of the talks, and that was the idea behind my talk, was to make sure that they would actually be engaged with my work and what we're doing here.
I want to talk about your topic in just a minute, the topic of your lecture, because I think it's pivotal as sort of a bridge between what we're trying to accomplish with a science festival and what we're trying to do as a university and what's going on in the community and community at large. But among these distinguished lectures, there's one man who's coming from New York. Where's he from? Boston?
Connecticut.
Connecticut, close enough, yeah. Carl Zimmer. But let's talk a little bit about Carl Zimmer for those who may not be familiar with him, but probably many people have heard the name. And in what context and what is he going to talk about when he's here?
I think Jim can talk more to this. I know him as a science writer and have read some of his work with evolution
I've known him
education.
since he was a child, almost. Not kidding, but he's really the foremost writer on modern biology. He's written, I think, something like 10 books, all for popular audiences, but they can get you into looking at proteins on the shells of viruses, even though you may not know quite what a virus is. By the time you get done reading that book, you know all about it, and it's really cool stuff. Modern biology is the intellectual adventure of our time. With genomics, it's just exploded, and we're finding out things that would totally shock people. If you could go back 15 years and tell them such and such is common knowledge, they go, what? There's all kinds of really cool things. And he's the guy really out there all over the place who's explicating it. He writes books. He writes a weekly column for the New York Times in the science section. He's written for Atlantic, Slate, Discover, National Geographic. He was one of the original big bloggers for National Geographic, which does more science blogging than anybody right now. He's really, really neat. He can explain all kinds of things that seem totally mysterious to people and let you see how totally cool they are. He's recently done stuff about human evolution in the New York Times that most people in anthropology, paleoanthropology, would find totally startling. We've always thought that Neanderthals were a totally separate species from us. We didn't even know that there was a third species living about the same time. This is about 50, 60,000 years ago in Eurasia. But he's looked at what the genes they've found in those bones are and how they show how we're related. You and I all have some Neanderthal genes in parts of our body. Why do we have those? And this is all totally new knowledge about us as people. And he's the guy who's told that story.
And I think he's a master at making this something that those of us who are not scientists can understand. So, Ian, if you had to pin a good starting age to come and hear him, what would be your recommendation in terms of folks who might be hearing this and want to learn more about Carl Zimmer and might want to bring younger members of their family? What's a good age to come and
I think high school students definitely could understand this. I think so. It may be a little difficult for them, but I think it'd be important for them to kind of see what he does, what he brings to the table. As Jim was saying, he's very good at science communication, so I think it would be good for them to see how someone of his intelligence is able to relate this to anyone, pretty much. And so I think that would be important.
Even middle school students, I think, he talks at a level where people like that can, there'll be things that'll be challenging and confusing, but on the other hand, it's fascinating. The stories he tells about this stuff is really, really interesting.
A couple weeks ago, maybe a month ago, here on the Livewire, we talked about UNC Charlotte's new adventure in a STEM early university high school, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and the fact that we're going to be starting one here on campus this coming fall. And the university's increasing role in providing leadership in this community, in science education, and inspiring science students at an even earlier age. And clearly doing an event like the Science Festival is aimed at that as well. But Ian, your talk on April 10th, the title is Defending Science Education. And tell us a little bit about what you're talking about and your overall subject area here at UNC Charlotte as a professor in science education.
So my talk is going to focus on the latest attempts to undermine science and science education throughout the country, with the more recent bills that have been introduced as a way to kind of change how it's taught in the classroom. So I'll talk about that and then how that relates to some things that we've noticed in North Carolina historically, and also some things that are kind of cropping up more lately. It would definitely be dealing some with politics of science, but also just with communication as well. And my research focuses on this area, especially with evolution education and climate change education, and then with films as well. So I'm part of that process when we do the discussion of our films. And then what I do here is that I actually am an elementary science educator, and I teach future elementary school teachers how to teach science. And so I teach methods courses every semester, and I absolutely love working with these students. They're undergrads, and I like to look at it as that, as you were saying, we like to get the younger population, that I love the challenge of getting 25 to 30 students in there that most of them are scared of science, and then changing that attitude by the time they're done, and letting them realize that this is really a great thing to teach and very exciting. And I've had many actually come up to me recently and said, while student teaching, they've found this is their favorite subject to teach, and they hated it before they took my class. And so what's important to me is getting those people who are going to be our future elementary school teachers to enjoy teaching it again, so that we can get our younger population, the children, to actually start having it again in their classroom and get excited about it. And I think that's where something like the expo comes in to play, is that it's another way to show kids, and people of all ages, but we do target children with some of the tables, but it's a great way just to get them engaged and excited about what we as a university have to offer, but what science has to offer as well.
To get back to Ian's lecture, I've got to say that one thing we did this year that was a little bit controversial, and we discussed it somewhat, was we actually deliberately decided that we would include some of these large discussions about science where science is becoming political. If you ask most scientists if science is a political topic, they would say no.
Right.
It has nothing to do with politics. We don't have biases, but it has entered the political sphere, and we're having these large-scale discussions about whether or not this is a hoax or this is made up, and whether this is evidence or that is evidence, and this kind of thing. So we can pretend that it doesn't exist, or we can actually look at it a little bit. And I think the public is actually interested in looking at it. And we have two events. One is his talk, and the other one is the Chasing Ice film that we're showing, which is a film about climate change. It's a documentary, and we don't expect everybody who's coming to this to agree with either his talk or with what the film is saying, but we need to have a forum for discussing these things and for bringing them out in the open and actually rather than shouting, communicating backward and forward. So those events are really actually aimed at adults who are interested in those topics.
Well, and it's certainly clearly central to our role as a university in Charlotte, and to be the convener of discussion. And it's exciting to see the many angles of UNC Charlotte's role in leading the science discussion in this community, kind of coming together. And again, as I said, the early university high school is going to be a great way to get a larger portion of our neighbors in Charlotte thinking about this institution as a place to be for science.
And I like to think, with my talk too, I'll focus on, not just with evolution education, climate change education, but there are efforts to actually redefine science in general, and that's where my expertise comes in. And so that's kind of where I'll be going, is the discussions that have gone on throughout the country over the past 10, 20 years, and even longer, but more recently, with the discussions about what is science and attempts to redefine what science is. And my goal is to try to inform my students in my classroom, and then the public in general, about what science is, what science can and cannot do. And that's kind of what I'll be talking about.
Well, what we've been showing on the screen so far is the poster that folks are going to start seeing around campus and around town. When you see this, you'll be reminded that there are several other lectures and discussions. And one point that's worth making is, as you see on the poster in the little green box, that the locations vary, and we want folks to go to the website. And before we're done today, we're going to touch on the website as well. Most of the events and activities will be on the main campus here or at Center City. And let's talk about this year's Science Festival, the addition of a film festival within the Science Festival. And let's talk through the films that have been selected and talk about what we're going to be doing in addition to just saying, hey, come and watch a film that's either directly or somewhat connected to science. What else are we doing? And starting with the film Contagion, which we'll be showing.
So the idea, okay,
good.
And I kind of want to talk about this one because this is the one that I'm on the panel for. So the idea behind the films was to, as you said, not just show films and say, come watch films, let's eat popcorn and hang out. It was more of a let's watch this film and then have a panel discussion with any number of experts, from 1 to 3 or 4 experts per panel, to have this discussion about what that film kind of tells us about science, or in that particular area. So the first one out for Contagion, which if you haven't seen it, I definitely recommend you coming to see it. It's an outstanding movie, and it does a very nice job of accurately portraying what it's like when there's a major outbreak, and then how people like the CDC have to then try to figure out how to solve the problem. And so it actually does a very nice job of illustrating that area of science, which we know a lot of times, popular science fiction films don't do a good job with that, but this one actually does a nice job with that. And so my area of research with films is how we use the films to improve people's understandings of nature of science, scientific inquiry, and scientists. And so part of the discussion will be how we can use this film Contagion in an educational setting.
And you will be part of the discussion.
Yes.
And the format is we all come, we watch the film, and then we talk about it.
Correct.
Panel talks, and then audience asks questions, and we have a dialogue about it. This is actually one of the ways that the public first encounters science. I mean, these films are really, I'm going to embarrass you, this was your idea, that we do a film series, and I think it's wonderful because, in fact, this is the way that people actually begin to know anything about anything that's going on. Most people found out about genomics by watching Jurassic Park, which is one of the films that were and Gattaca and some other. I mean, but so Invisible Man.
Well, going way back in time, and we talk about science as a theme for motion pictures goes back to the very earliest, the very first silent films, and then in various other eras of our history too, there's also a connection to what's going on in the world around us is reflected in films, and quite often when times are difficult around us, we tend to see films that relate to
like Body Snatchers,
scary things,
Body Snatchers in the McCarthy era,
turbulent times, or disaster films of the 70s, that kind of thing. But the Invisible Man is an example of some perceptions of science, and obviously it's based on H.G. Wells, so it goes back even further than the 1930s and 40s. But
there's a kind of concept in there that somebody can drink something and it'll change them and make their body change so the light passes through it. Nobody can see them. And we actually have with us a researcher on our campus who's one of the leading researchers in the field of invisibility studies. They actually can take something like this cup and put things around, materials around it, so that you, from most angles, looking at it, you would see light just bend around the cup, and you wouldn't see the cup. So there is a reality to invisibility. We're also going to have a chemist, that physicist's name is Greg Gaber, and a chemist named Marcus Jones, who does light chemistry. So they're going to talk about real chemistry and physics and how this works in this. But the truth is that the whole concept of making somebody invisible is a fictional concept to begin with, that nonetheless is then slowly filtered its way into science. You have that, then you have Star Trek and cloaking devices and things, which are actually closer to what you're really talking about with invisibility. And science fiction writers have invented these things before the scientists have actually found out how to do them. It's interesting. It's a give and take backward and forward.
It's probably also worth mentioning that in putting forth a festival of films that are based on concepts and views of science at the time at which they're made, or forward thinking or backward thinking, it's interesting really to get a reminder of the science involved in making motion pictures at the time too, and I'm sure that's going to lend itself to a film and presentation in and of itself, perhaps in next year's. But one of the other films in this year's festival, and again we'll touch on the website in a minute so folks can see the dates and times again. But one of the other films in this year's festival, as you said, is Jurassic Park, which the making of which relies heavily on scientific.
No, there's a lot of accuracy in that.
Oh,
film.
yeah, I'm sure there is. Yeah.
No,
There's a lot of
it's
an interesting comparison.
They had to do some interviews with folks who actually remembered the
dinosaurs.
Did I?
Exactly.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, what's interesting with this, some of the work I've read because of my film research is that it argues the difference between the accuracy of science fiction films versus the authenticity, and I think Jurassic Park is a perfect example of that. That obviously the accuracy here is limited. But at the same time, the authenticity behind the film of the way some of the scientists act in the film, the layout of the lab that you see when they get to the island, those types of things, they went through a lot of effort to actually make that as authentic as they could. And there were still some complaints about it, but there was a lot of authentic parts of the display of scientific inquiry, display of the work of scientists in this film. And also, too, the science advisor for this film, and I always forget his name.
Jack Horner.
Thank you, Jack Horner.
Who's the main character, played by Sam Neill, is based on Jack Horner, who's a real-life paleontologist, very famous.
And some of as we talk about the importance of films, some of the research I've read has pointed out that for Jurassic Park, especially, it was an opportunity for Jack Horner to kind of use his area of research and his expertise to kind of push his ideas more into the mainstream conversation. And at the time, it was more about the relationship between dinosaurs and modern-day birds versus reptiles, and that was not as settled as it is now. And so they were able to kind of push into that into the mainstream conversation.
There are a lot of concepts. That film, what's inaccurate about the film is that you can't find DNA that old, not embedded in amber. As far as we know, the oldest DNA that you can find is about 100,000 years old. This still is recoverable in any kind of shape or form. But, the concept of using an existing animal, the idea in that movie is that they take a turtle's egg and they then mess around with the genes and reconstruct the dinosaur DNA from bits and pieces using bioinformatics, which in fact we're doing here. And that, in fact, is true. You can go and rebuild. You can find out from little bits and pieces of things, just tiny little fragments of DNA. Those people can figure out where this piece connects to that piece and build back the whole gene. That's all real, and the idea of putting it in an egg of another species is real. One of the things Carl Zimmer has written about recently is this idea of de-extinction. Which is what's, of course, Jurassic Park is about. So far, people are talking about de-extincting the passenger pigeon because we have an existing pigeon that's a close relative. So you could take an egg of that existing pigeon and add in different genes into where they differ and have a passenger pigeon come back. You could also do that with the mammoth using elephants. And these things are not science fiction. People are working on these problems right now.
Something that struck me too in thinking about these films and looking at Jurassic Park and being reminded that it came out in 1993, which at that time, this must have seemed to the audience like complete science fiction with really no context. You think 1993, that's even a couple years before most of us knew what the World Wide Web was going to be. So I think that will be a fun perspective too when we're discussing the film afterwards to think in terms of how far we've come in just our general street knowledge and appreciation for the principles.
Because of that movie,
here.
among other things,
Yeah.
and people were introduced to it. There's a very famous quote by Arthur C. Clarke, who's a science fiction, famous now dead science fiction writer. He said any sufficiently advanced technology should be indistinguishable from magic. And that's what, you know, the movie, when Michael Crichton wrote that book and they made that movie, Spielberg made the movie, they were counting on the fact that people would see this as magic. But in fact, some of this genomic work was going on in labs. Nobody knew about it. Yeah. And you begin saying, what if, you know, if they did this and do that, and people go, whoa. Yeah. And, you know, it seems like just a totally science fiction fantasy thing. But as you point out, you know, 20 years later, here we are, and the truth is we know a whole lot about that. And if somebody looks at this video 20 years from now, they'll say, yeah, we've had mammoths wandering around the Midwest for a decade now. Yep. You know?
Yeah, and I've often thought, somewhat seriously, if only we could do the same thing, say, with Disney's Hall of Presidents at Disney World and bring Abraham Lincoln back. Anyway, that's...
You don't know, they already have.
I digress. Yeah, they probably already have. But again, these films are part of the Science Festival, March 28th through April 13th. And as you look at the website, you'll be able to see the dates and the location for the films, most of which will be here on the main campus and at Center City. And then the other film that will be showing during the Science Festival is one that you've touched on already, Jim, related to global warming, and the title is Chasing Ice. And do we remember this when it was around over the last year or so, or is it?
I'll be honest, I have never actually seen it. I've only read about it.
It's absolutely, I mean, breathtaking. Yeah. The imagery behind this and the efforts that the director went to, he's a photographer, and the efforts he went to kind of document the ice and the shifting of ice around the world is just absolutely amazing. And so when I went to see this in the theater, you know, the first thing that I thought is that why don't we have a panel right now to have this discussion? And there were several people in the audience that I could tell, you know, a few of us started talking, and we really wanted to be able to stay after and have a nice long conversation about it, because it was the kind of movie that really made you think about what was going on, and it wasn't an attempt to be, you know, propaganda. It was actually showing real events that had occurred and things that they had caught.
Tell them what the movie is actually about. I mean, if you could summarize what they do in the movie.
So I'll do my best. That from what I remember watching it the one time is that they kind of are going around the world showing the reduction of the amount of ice, and, you know, the impacts of climate change, global warming, and climate change on the amount of ice we have at the poles, and so especially with glaciers and those types of things. And so they have, like, there's this one scene in the film that they happen to catch this breaking off of a massive part of this sheet of ice, and it was one of the largest ones captured, and they just happened to be there when this happened. And it's just absolutely amazing to see this sudden shift and break off of all of this ice coming off of one of the glaciers. I think that one was in Greenland, and it was just absolutely incredible. So it's his journey documenting these types of things over, I'm not sure how long it took him to do it, but
a couple of years, I think.
Yeah.
Summer work. That clip, by the way, is up on our Facebook page. If you
that's right. Yeah.
Search on Facebook for UNC Charlotte Science Technology Expo, you'll pull up a page where we have a lot of different little posts and features about the things that we're going to be doing and other things. And there's that clip we recently put up, so you can actually see the little short. It's a stunning piece of video of this thing the size of half of the size of Manhattan all falling into the sea at once.
And it was sudden. You know, it just happens very, very quickly. And one of the things I love about this film is that it is considered a documentary, but that it is, you know, true events. It's not a science fiction film. And so I think it's very interesting. You know, another science fiction film that people sometimes talk about with climate change and global warming was The Day After Tomorrow. You know, there's a lot of issues with that film. this particular film is taking a different stance, being that it's a documentary, but actually documenting what happened and what is happening around the world.
In the panel we have for that event, we have a couple of our own climatologists here from campus, but we've also pulled in a couple of Channel 36 WCNC weather reporters. John Wendell is the first one we contacted. And I'm sorry, I can't remember. I've got it written here somewhere in front of me, the name of the other one. But they deal with weather on a daily basis, and they also, of course, know all about climatology.
Sure.
So you've got people who actually deal with the weather phenomena. Weather and climate are very different from each other, but they're related.
Sure.
And people find this confusing. All kinds of people find it confusing. It'd be an interesting discussion for people who are trying to figure out why, once again, we've got the polar vortex freezing us, or why it is that it's not raining in California. And does that have anything to do with global warming or not?
And I think what's interesting about this film, if we touch on it real quick, is that some may say, well, showing this film as part of the North Carolina Science Festival, we don't have glaciers now in North Carolina, so what's the point? But I think what's interesting is that a big conversation in our state now is sea level rise, and this definitely touches on the aspect of sea level rise. We know that the sea levels will rise, and we know they're rising at potentially at an alarming rate, and so the loss of this ice and the melting of this ice obviously makes that problem even worse. And so I think it's interesting that we'll be able to tie that discussion in with the sea level rise discussion we're having in our state.
Yeah, when a 1,000-foot thick sheets of ice the size of half the island of Manhattan fall into the sea in a minute and a half, I mean, you can see that it has something to do with sea level rise.
Right.
Sure. Well, let's go through just a few more images from the Science Expo, the Science and Technology Expo itself, that is part of the Science Festival. And just to keep things straight, the Science Festival runs March 28th through April 13th, and that entails some healthy rounds of lectures and discussions, and the film festival that we just discussed. And the times and locations are all on the website that we'll look at in just a minute. But then on April 13th from 10 to 2, that's a Sunday.
Yeah,
that's
Sunday.
4 hours on a
It's
Sunday.
traditionally how we've been doing it.
And it will be spring and it will be warm. You guarantee that.
Yeah, no rain.
We're doing our best.
We won't be chasing any ice that day.
No.
Yes.
But that will be the day that many folks remember and associate. That's the Science and Technology Expo. And these images capture just a smattering of some of the folks. Is that an Amazon.com drone?
It
that he's looking at there?
basically is. I
Yes.
think, yes, it's a little quadruped flying drone that boy's looking at. And we're going to have, at this particular one this year, it's going to be a vastly expanded expo. We're going to have at least 50% more, I would say more likely double the size of
Here on
activities
campus,
on-
over in the that plaza area
by
across
the
from
Union.
Student Union.
And with easy parking right nearby at the Union deck, and then there are other decks if that fills up. But we all free parking, and the whole thing is totally free. We have some great community partners participating in that this year. CMS Schools is going to send a bunch of different schools with some hands-on science stuff that they do in their classroom that may inspire other parents and other teachers to think about things they can do in their classroom. We, of course, will have all kinds of our specialties here. We're going to have a gigantic robotics display this year. Because kids love robots, and we've got people both on campus and off campus who do really cool things with robots. Robots will track you and fire Nerf balls at you and
Are
hunt
they
you
invisible
down.
yet?
Yeah, they're
No.
not invisible yet, but
Maybe
we're
next year.
working
Next
on
year,
it.
Yeah.
Next year they'll be flying over you and you won't know.
And they'll deliver your packages.
That'd be great. That'd be great.
Well, I think what's important about the Science Expo is that it's very hands-on, very interactive. It's not like a science fair where people come and just kind of look at things.
Sure.
Is that what I love about it, and I have a table that I'm actually having my students help run this year, is that it allows people of all ages to come and actually get their hands dirty, so to speak, and play with different things. And so like with the robots and just all of the different displays and tables that we'll have, people will have an opportunity to actually interact with stuff. And so it's
stream table where you can make a river flow and create a landscape and do this stuff. Again, it with sand and water and all the other.
Well, given that a number of the folks who see this discussion or parts of our discussion on YouTube later are part of the immediate UNC Charlotte community, or here in Charlotte in general, opportunities to volunteer.
Well, we always need volunteers.
Especially this year.
Especially this year, yes. We're trying very hard to get students to volunteer, but if anybody besides students wants to volunteer, they can, there are phone numbers out there on the web.
We'll look on this website that we have up on the screen right now, and there on the website, folks can drill around and get all the details of the events and activities, but then there is a way to get in touch with you directly?
Yeah,
or
directly, yes.
Right.
I think my phone number is out there on some of those things.
so all call Jim.
Everybody call me. And if anybody has something that they haven't contacted us and we haven't contacted them, but they have something cool that they want to, that's science and that's educational and it's not dangerous, we would be very interested in having all comers come. We have a number of corporations that are coming. Arriva, Westinghouse, Duke are all putting on displays, doing things, doing some educational things. So we really want to, as you were saying before about public universities, about our university, we really want to be the nexus for this stuff. You know, come here and we'll help you do it and help you show off and help you interest people. All kinds of people out there are interested in science education and technology education and in showing off our state, and let's just do it and get the community involved.
So if it's spring and it's UNC Charlotte, and it will be both of those in a matter of days, it's time for the Science Festival and the Science and Technology Expo. So March 28th through April 13th, and we'll be keeping tabs on this as it unfolds on the website, and folks can see clips from our conversation on YouTube in the coming days.
And you'll wear that button,
I'll
Proud
wear the-
Science Geek,
yeah,
for the
and
rest of the
and
spring.
I might even put on the shirt, we'll see, but yes.
The shirt that will make it very hard for us to see later
It's a
on.
vivid shirt, that's
Yes,
for
it
sure.
is.
So. All right, well, Jim Hathaway and Ian Binns, thank you for joining us. And
Thank you.
thank you to all of you who put us on your screen for the live wire here on Inside UNC Charlotte. And we'll look forward to seeing you again next week at the same time. Thank you very much.